to the first annual Ghost of Greeneville storytelling event. Just wanted to remind everybody that the Cub Scouts from Pack 93 in Afton are here doing a fundraiser. They're hoping to go to space camp. About halfway through the program, we're going to have a brief 5 to 7 minute intermission, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Capitol Theater, I'd like to welcome you to the first annual Ghosts of Greeneville storytelling event. My name is Edith O'Keefe Susong, and I will be your host this evening. Most people know me as Miss Edith, so you can just refer to me as that. I'd like to say a couple things before I introduce our first storyteller. I'm someone who has always taken pride in where I come from. And this part of the world holds a very special value for me. Despite all of the challenges that it has thrown my way, it has pushed me to become who I am, and I take pride in that. I started off as a social butterfly and never once imagined that I would one day become the first female newspaper publisher in the state of Tennessee. In 1916, my husband took on the dying newspaper, the Greeneville Democrat, as a legal fee, but he wasn't much interested in running the paper, so I decided to take it on. Despite assurances from many kind souls, including 2 rival newspaper men, that I would never succeed. Well, I figured with a name like the Greeneville Democrat in a political climate like Greeneville's, of course I wouldn't succeed. But fortunately, I had the chance to rename my paper after acquiring the 2 papers of my rivals, the Searchlight and the Sun. Changed my paper's name to the Greeneville Democrat Sun, but I'm sure you can figure out why that was ultimately unpopular. And today, you have only to look around at newsstands around the town to see just how badly I failed. The Greeneville Sun is one of the few family-owned newspapers still in existence in this country. I'd like to think of myself and of that paper as examples of the good that Greene County has to give to the world. Strength of character, strong values, and a willingness to do what needs to be done. Things have changed since that time. It was a man's world when I first started writing, and so I assumed the pen name E.O. Susong to convince my readership that I was male. It was a different era, an era in which the color of your skin determined where you would sit in this theater. Unfortunately, we have left such dividing times behind us, and today we all gather together to remember our past, both the ups and the downs, the lights and the darks, and to take pride in what our ancestors have achieved. I would like to first welcome one of the most influential members of our past, a revered family man and community member, the founder of the oldest college in Tennessee. Please welcome the Reverend Samuel Doak.
I will first put on my Scottish cap. There's only one portrait remaining of me that shows me in my Scottish cap. In those days, we didn't heat our churches all that much in the wintertime. And of course, we had no way of cooling them in the summer. And being Scotch-Irish, we did not spend a lot of money on heating. So the cap really came very necessary and would also, in a way, mark me as a clergyman. I be the Reverend Samuel Doak. I've always thought that God must have had October in mind when he made that as the end of the summer south of the Ohio River, because it was a beautiful place to which I came in those days. It was 1777. War was in the air. Things were changing everywhere. It was a critical time. And I made my way from Pennsylvania down the Little Limestone Creek to the place where the Watauga and the Holston rivers come together. And I stayed there and served God in my own way a couple of years. And then I came on down and followed the little creek into that part of North Carolina that was Sullivan County. And I felt it was my duty to come. I'll have to tell you that I am an old side Presbyterian minister. Presbyterians have always been willing to take sides on many issues. I had a graduate of the same seminary I went at Princeton College. His name was Hezekiah Balch, and he was coming into this same area. You might think that ministers liked one another. Ministers really are just human beings like the rest of you. There's just some people you don't like. I could talk a lot of things with him about education. But when it came to theology and what congregations ought to sing in church and other things about human sin, he was just much too loud for me. He could be very boisterous even when he was wrong. But there's one thing that we did both hold in common, and that was a belief in common sense. Now, there's a couple of ways, to my mind, that people know things. One way is by training and using the God-given senses that every human being has. And we learn things that we didn't know before. Well, for example, when I came down into this part of the country, I knew that if I would follow the Little Limestone Creek, I would sooner or later run into people, because people always come to water sooner or later. But not everybody in the world knows that. You have to learn it. You have to experience it through the senses that you can trust. And you can make a lot of knowledge by using those senses as God intended you to do. But there are other things, friends, that we don't have to learn. And that's what I call common sense. The senses that we all have in common, those things we don't have to learn, that we know as human beings. Every person born on God's green earth knows that it's better to be alive than to be dead. Everybody in the world knows that it's better to be free than it is to be a slave to anything. And everyone knows that it's much better to find happiness and satisfaction and live in a place where you can do that than to wake up every morning miserable and afraid and lonely. Freedom, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, life, those are things that everyone knows in common sooner or later in their lives. Common sense. I also believe that one thing a person had to do was to train that mind. So I was always convicted that I had to do something to help educate the masses of people. We Scotch-Irish came to this country after our ancestors had journeyed from England to Scotland to Ireland and then here to the colonies. And usually it was a movement made in order to get away from big church and big government, because it was our experience that those things sometimes, somehow, were operated by those who thought themselves elite. Even sometimes people who thought that God had made it that way, that they should rule us. Even that they were somehow better than we were. And we lived in the knowledge that no one on God's earth was better than we were, or born to be more than we were. Well, if you go now and you examine everything and every place from the equator to the poles, you will find a diversity of color. And people of those varied colors will think of their color as the very best. What we know is that God has given us a world like that. And He has blessed all of us, regardless of our color. Color may make us best in our own minds, but not better than anyone else. Of course, I had slaves. I actually inherited some slaves through my second wife's family. Experience tells me you have to be careful who you marry the second time. And I was a person who knew that little Phyllis, who was one of those who came to me into my house, she knew that she ought to be free. I knew that she ought to be free. But what was I to do? Little Phyllis, you are free, so go. But where and to what? No, I was a gradualist. I was not a fanatic who was willing to burn down my house in order to get to where I think we ought to be, because for every purpose under heaven, God has a time. And a person of faith can live in that knowledge even when one knows that there are times that are very, very wrong. I did eventually free my slaves, the older ones sooner, and little Phyllis just very near my death. So curse me for being a gradualist if you wish, but don't ever question my abolitionist heart. It wasn't long after I came to this area that I was again riding through the forest when I heard sounds of people working and saws and axes, and I came upon a group of woodcutters from the little community of Salem. And when they recognized me as a clergyman, they said, "Oh, we need you to give us a sermon." Can you imagine that? When would you rather stop woodcutting and listen to a sermon? I have listened to a lot of sermons in my lifetime when I knew in my heart I would be better off out cutting the wood, especially from that other minister I just mentioned. But they said, "Give us a sermon," and I felt it was my duty. And so I set myself up in my saddle and I preached them a sermon. And then they said, "Reverend, come to our village of Salem and be a minister to our families." And so I did. But within 2 years, I had also set up Martin Academy for all the people who lived in that area who wanted to come, people who were farmers like myself, which I was. And Martin Academy became a thriving institution. It was the first institution of learning west of the Allegheny Mountains. Now, Hezekiah Balch had started Greeneville College, And so he always said, I started the first college west of the Alleghenies. And I said, I started the first educational institution. Don't know what you do at your place, so there. I stayed there until 1818, when I moved down to what was generally among the educators called College Creek, later named something else, Frank or something, to help my son, John Witherspoon, develop Tusculum Academy. John Witherspoon Doak was named after John Witherspoon, the Presbyterian minister who signed the Declaration of Independence and who was the first president of Princeton College in New Jersey. And we did that because education is important. Because if God has given us in our hearts the knowledge that life is better than death, that happiness is better than discontent, that liberty is better than slavery, when we are working for those things, it follows that God Himself is working with us in those things. So that's why, when the time came and settled my family, I taught my family that we must defend ourselves against all comers who try to take our life, our liberty, or our pursuit of happiness. And although we may take great pain in doing that, somehow God does assist those who work in those enterprises. So I told my wife, when I have to leave and be gone, if you see hostiles in the area who seem to be going to do you badly, you take our children and you hie away to the encampment of John Sevier, because he will keep a group of people there, and you'll be safe. And certainly, when I one day had to make a trip up to Abington, just 30 miles away, she saw these hostiles lurking in the trees. And when they became menacing, she took the children, and as she fled away, she watched our house burn. But she was safe. And then another time, when those same people came back to do us harm, and they began shooting their rifles, and the bullets kept coming in through our windows, I said to my wife, "What are you doing, lady?" Because she was over at the fireplace picking up the mini balls and melting them and reforming them. And she brought me a little handful of them, and she said, "Good sir, take these and send them back to them. They belong to them anyway." And she helped defend our place. It seems to me that we have come a long way. We've come a long way in our education. I had Martin Academy certified by the state of North Carolina and named after the governor of North Carolina. And then when the state of Franklin was born, I had it recertified when the legislature met at Jonesboro. And somehow we began to build a place where there could be freedom, liberty, happiness. I brought a little quotation to close with, and I bring it because I just got it not too long ago. It was written by Robbie Burns in the old country, and he has a prayer that is my prayer. "Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will for that sense and worth o'er all the earth shall take the prize," and all that. that man to man the world o'er shall be brothers for all that. So be it. Thank you. I would like to take a moment to introduce a guest here today. I'd like to have the real Samuel Doak stand up. Captain Doak and his wife Emily. Captain Doak has become a good friend of mine, I feel. And he is now get this, the 8th generation descended from Reverend Samuel Doak. And he has a son and a grandson, so now there is an 11th generation. And I'm very thankful that he could be here, and thank you so much, Captain Doak, for coming. And Emily?
The state of Tennessee as we know it today did not come together without a great deal of contention. And here to tell us a little bit more about that fascinating time is Joe Tennis.
It all began on a fishing trip on the Nolichucky River. 2 little boys. Little Zach, he was from Knoxville, he was 9 years old. And there was Thomas, he was 10, he was from Abingdon, Virginia. And they were staying on the summer with their uncle, Big John, a very goofy man who kind of went, "Urgh," every time that the boys would do something wrong. Well, he took the boys fishing down on the Nolichucky River. One little boy caught a rock bass. The other little boy caught a bluegill. And as they came back around, Big John just kept getting his line tied up in knots. And then eventually, he fell into the water of the Nolichucky and started flapping around looking like a lost duck. His fishing pole floated on down the river. He was embarrassed. But as he stepped to get back up on the mud, his hand reached and hit something. It was a small board, not much bigger than this book. And on that board, the little boys scooped it up and brought it back, and it said, "Franklin Treasury." Now Zach, he looked at Big John and he says, "What do you think this is?" And Thomas goes, "It says something. Sir, it might be a treasure. What do you think it is, Big John?" "Urgh," Big John growled. "I think that dumb board gave me a splinter." "Well, it might mean something," Thomas said. "It's old. It's like a mystery. It's very, very old." "Well, throw it in the back of the truck," Big John said. "Let's go home. It's time for supper." Well, as they get back home to the farm at Mount Hebron, they have a man come over. They called him Old Man Dan. He was 101 years old. And he says, "Boys, I think, where did you get this board?" And they said, Zach goes, "We went fishing and it was the only thing that Big John caught." And he says, "I think you found something." He said, "Found what?" He says, "I think you found a piece of the old cabin that's been missing ever since before I was a kid." "Before you was a kid," Zach said. "What, like when the dinosaurs was around?" And he said, "No, I'm talking about 1896 and 1897. And they said, what are you talking about really? They said, "We're talking about the State of Franklin cabin and the Capitol building that stood here in Greeneville on Main Street." And I said, "Well, what happened to it?" And he said, "Well, years and years and years ago, before we had a Tennessee, we were called Franklin. North Carolina had ceded its westernmost area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, including the newly formed counties of Sullivan, Washington, and Greene, to the federal government in 1784 to pay for its share of a Revolutionary War debt. Now, the residents of the mountainous region immediately grew afraid of having no government at all. So they borrowed an idea from Arthur Campbell. He was a Virginian, and in 1782 he came up with this idea that said we should carve out a new state in what became Kentucky and Virginia, Tennessee and North Carolina, maybe even as far south as what is now Alabama. Several men met at Jonesboro in 1784, and they decided to come up with this new state. And they elected John Sevier, a native of Augusta County, Virginia, as the governor. They initially called it Frank Land. Frank Land was an Anglo-Saxon word meaning land of the free. This infant state within months became Franklin. And why was that? Well, that was for political purposes. Because the gentleman who got this all together, they said, why don't we name it after Benjamin Franklin? He's a pretty powerful man. He might help us. Well, Benjamin Franklin got word of this, and basically he said, that's okay. I'm not really that interested in getting involved. Where was the state of Franklin? Largely the state existed in what is now East Tennessee, from Bristol on the Virginia border to the present-day Blount County. This would include the counties of Hawkins and Sullivan, Johnson, Carter, Washington, Unicoi, Greene, Hamlin, Jefferson, Cox, Sevier, and Blount. Though the exact boundaries remain unclear, some historians also claim that Franklin, including parts or all of Hancock, Claiborne, Granger, Union, and Knox counties, along with sections of western North Carolina and the high country of Ashe County. The capital moved from Jonesboro to Greeneville in 1785, but Franklin faded by 1788. 2 years later, the state of Franklin region became part of the territory of the United States south of the River Ohio, better known as the Southwest Territory, which in 1796 became the state of Tennessee. But what happened to Franklin's original Capitol building? Well, when I was a little boy, visiting my granddaddy who lived at 300 North Main Street, about 3 blocks up here. His name was Linton Boswell. He died in 1980. And when I was a little kid, growing up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where my mom had settled, we came and played in the old state of Franklin Capitol building. Little knowing then, or would have even cared then as a kid, to know that that was a replica building. And why is that? Because according to tradition, that old log structure in Greeneville was dismantled in 1897, piece by piece, and hauled by wagon to Knoxville. Then it was shipped by barge from Knoxville to Nashville for Tennessee's centennial celebration, held in 1897. And why in 1897? Because they ran out of money to hold it in 1896. They didn't hold it in 1896. So the whereabouts of the building are unknown after the exhibition. The logs are possibly thrown away. Perhaps they were just stolen. Perhaps they floated away in a flood. But that is the mission behind this particular book I wrote called Finding Franklin, Mystery of the Lost State Capitol, in which I have a lot of fun with the state of Franklin, because I don't think that it is a very well-known fact of what we have here to have a state named for one of the most famous Americans of all time, Benjamin Franklin, and to have a state that is now lost, and to have a capital that is now lost, and according to my characters and their imagination, perhaps even having a fortune that is now lost as well. I've written about a lot of different subjects over the years in writing for newspapers in this area for the last 20 years, primarily with the Kingsport paper for a year and at the Bristol paper for the last 19 years. And in the course of doing so, I've released 7 books now. And of these 7 books, some of them tell stories of Tennessee, some of them tell stories of Virginia. One of my favorite stories comes from Abingdon, Virginia. And it's the story that I heard mentioned of a town heard mentioned by the last presenter in Abingdon, Virginia. We have a treasure in Abingdon, Virginia, not far from where I live in Bristol, that came from the dream of a man who was born in 1905 at a little town called Austinville, Virginia. Now, Austinville used to be known as the lead mines. And around the time of Arthur Campbell, around the time of the men who helped create the state of Franklin, These men in the 1770s got together before the Declaration of Independence and came up with something called the Fincastle Resolutions. And the Fincastle Resolutions were basically to determine that these men refused to give up the rights that they believed they were owed. This was a forerunner of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the lead mines community in Austinville today is known as Austinville for the family of Moses Austin, whose son Stephen Austin went to Texas and became known as the father of Texas. But this